Uh, Thank you to Aspetar and to Olivier for inviting me here. I don't know if it's good to be last. In some ways, I think it's good because I get to try to change some of the presentation a little bit on what other people have said. In fact, this one I'm actually giving in place of Ben Levine, who's my mentor and friend who couldn't be with us. So I guess it gives me a chance to defend the faith a little bit in light of some of the knocks on altitude training, so to speak. So I'll try to do my best, Ben Levine, but I'm going to try not to be as forceful, let's say, as Ben can be sometimes in trying to push some things down your throat with this. So a big question we have a lot of times with altitude training is the timing of competition on return. And oftentimes I'm asked, and many of you in the room are asked, what are some of the best practices with altitude training? And some of the common questions I think that everyone gets is, how high should we live? What altitude should we train at? How long should we stay at altitude? And I think largely through the work of a lot of people here in the room, we have some best practice recommendations that we can give to the coaches and the athletes. Another key question, again, that they ask is, when should I return to sea level prior to the major competition? And that's a little bit harder to address. There's not nearly as much data on that, but it's a key question in terms of application of altitude training. So if you look at what coaches believe, anecdotally, there's a very wide range of response. And this is, this is essentially a cartoon schematic, if you will, outlining some of the thoughts that many of the coaches have. And you have a mix of American coaches, some Russian coaches, with a range. Even some of them give the ideal date being 17 days afterwards, or 80% of your best performance is in this range sometime later. But if you take this all together and kind of assimilate it, in general, it's kind of a good timing, bad timing, good timing approach, meaning that coaches believe anecdotally that sometime in the first, let's say, 3 to 7 days after return from altitude might be a period of good performances, followed by some period of time, let's say somewhere between 7 and 14 days, where performances are not going to be as good as, let's say, they were immediately upon return. But then surprisingly, 14 days and out, or 14 days and longer, we see an increase in performance again. Is there any scientific data that we can look to that could kind of explain what the coaches anecdotally believe and are using? So that's been kind of an approach that I've taken in my lab, and Ben has taken a little bit we've done together, is to try to see if we can come up with some reasons why and try to answer this question. So there's 3 potential factors I want to share with you today for discussion. There's probably certainly more than 3, but 3 that we'll talk about. Certainly one is hematological factors, meaning what's the time course of the decay in red cell mass with return to sea level. So if you are of the belief that red cell mass is the primary player in terms of performance enhancement, certainly how fast those red cells go away is going to be a very important question. What about biomechanical or neuromuscular factors? Interestingly, especially in runners, when they come back from an altitude training camp, many of them will say that they just feel uncoordinated, especially at fast speeds. They just feel like neuromuscularly things aren't going very well, and they need some period of time at sea level to reestablish that kinesthetic feeling of having coordinated turnover. The other one that I'm very interested in as well are ventilatory factors, and some of this is going to tie in a little bit with some of the other information we've heard today. Certainly when every athlete goes to altitude, we're going to see some level of ventilatory acclimatization. For performance at altitude, it's going to be positive. But what about with return? Is that added ventilation going to be positive or negative for performance? And how long is it going to stay? How long does it take for it to go away? So let's start with the hematological data, and by far and away, I think the best data on this particular question of decay and return to sea level comes from Walter Schmidt's lab. And he's got data in swimmers, but I'm going to show you the data that he has in runners from Kenyan athletes who our high altitude residents coming down to sea level. And there's two big take-home messages here. One is, at least in the first 14 days in this group, no change in red cell mass, hemoglobin mass. But then after that, a very steady decline out to day 33, and then perhaps leveling off after about 33 days. What struck me when I first saw this data was how fast and how big the decline was, because if you ask a normal medical student, how long does a red blood cell last, what's the typical response you're going to get? About 120 days, right? So if you plot that, this would be your expected rate of decline if you had a normal rate of cell death and you simply didn't have any replacement. So something's going on to actually pull red blood cells or pull hemoglobin mass out. And what could it be? Well, it probably is a neocytolysis effect. And this is something that was first discovered in astronauts. You want to talk about altitude training, let's go to the astronauts, but it's a different mechanism than then with blood being centrally pooled. But what happens in astronauts is there's a selective destruction of the newest, youngest red cells being pulled out of the circulation. And the same thing is being shown to happen in altitude residents coming down to sea level. So why is this happening, and what's the mechanism for it? Well, the proposed mechanism, at least for right now, has to do with a little bit of endothelial function, as well as what's different about the surface of neocytes, of immature red blood cells. First off, the baby red blood cells, or neocytes, have something attached to them called surface adhesion molecules. They end up falling off as the red blood cell matures, but the young neocytes have them. And the problem is they tend to get stuck on things. Well, what could they get stuck on? Well, one of the things could be the endothelial wall. Normally, that's not a problem, because as long as EPO is present, the endothelial wall is going to be smooth, and the red cells, even with these surface adhesion molecules, are going to basically bounce right off them. The problem becomes when EPO is suppressed. For lack of a better term, the endothelial wall gets furry. And as it gets furry, if you will, these surface adhesion molecules attach. So I like to think of it as kind of like Velcro. Okay, so here's your endothelial wall. When EPO suppressed, gets furry, and then these surface adhesion molecules kind of attach to it. And then when that happens, they can get selectively pulled out of the circulation. So when is a period of time when EPO levels are going to get suppressed? Well, here's some data from Ben Levine and Jim Strait-Gunderson in a project that we did many years ago that we actually are trying now to publish 11 years later. And I think we're finally going to get it done. I have a 14-hour plane ride to finish it, going back. But here's EPO over time in 4 different groups living at 4 different altitudes. And the thing I want you to notice here is on return to sea level, and this is a very consistent response across our studies and across many of your studies as well, is that EPO is going to get suppressed below baseline upon return. So if this happens, you may think, gosh, you should compete right away, wouldn't you think? If EPO is going to get suppressed, we're going to start immediately beginning to pull red blood cells out of the circulation. You might want to compete right away. Well, there's some other data that's interesting. If you go back to some of the very early blood doping studies, and you look at changes in VO2 max and time to exhaustion in some of these studies, very highly fit group, 80 mLs per kg per minute, do a sham infusion. You see obviously no change in VO2 max, no change in time to exhaustion. In 24 hours and 7 days after reinfusion of red blood cells, we get about a 5% improvement in VO2 max, an improvement in time to exhaustion. But the really neat thing, I think, is look at 16 weeks. Certainly the added red blood cells are gone by 16 weeks, right? But still we see a continued increase in VO2 max and even an improved time to exhaustion. Well, what's the potential reason why? And most commonly, what is it? Well, in the first, say, 2 to 3 weeks, the athlete is still blood doped, if you will, and they can train harder at sea level. So it probably is a training effect that we're seeing being carried on. So in that case, even though the red blood cells with neocytolysis may be being removed very quickly upon return to sea level, it's that training over the first, particularly 2 weeks, in my opinion, can help mitigate. So you have red blood cells going down, but you have fitness, if you will, increasing, and they might cancel each other out, extending performance for a period of time. And we'll talk a little bit more about that training effect here later. So one other interesting thing that I want to note is another thing from Walter's data is the change in blood volume over time. And so when the athletes come down to sea level, you see an increase in blood volume that stays there for quite a while, and that's clearly an increase in plasma volume. And so we said, well, what if we kind of look at these two together? What if we look at hemoglobin mass and blood volume and look at oxygen carrying capacity as well as some cardiac function effects? And so if you're familiar with Ed Coyle's work, he's done a lot of great stuff in terms of changes in stroke volume as a function of volume changes in the blood. And he's got data that suggests for about every 10 milliliters of increase in blood volume, you're going to get about a 0.3 milliliter increase in stroke volume, give or take a little bit. So Walter, what we did is we took your data and we said, well, based on the plasma volume change or the blood volume change, what could we expect to see over time in the change in stroke volume? And you can see the changes here. And then we made some assumptions about maximal heart rate, what it might be, and we assumed it didn't change over time. And this would be the change in maximal cardiac output. And then we made some assumptions about what saturation was, and we assumed it would stay constant. And look at the change in oxygen delivery. So even here at 21 days, when the hemoglobin mass is significantly lower, because of changes in plasma volume and blood volume, we're not too far different, if you will. So from a timing standpoint, we got a lot of different things going on, don't we? So at the end of the day, evidence suggests, particularly from Walter's work, no loss in hemoglobin mass in the first 14 days after return to sea level. So that might suggest compete right away. On the other hand, I certainly believe there's better training over those initial days at sea level. And from that, I think there's a training effect response that we're going to see later on. So with that, it might be okay to go ahead and compete later. There's also going to be, certainly with everything, individual variation. How many times have you heard that today? Individual changes in hemoglobin mass and plasma volume with time at sea level. What are the effects on cardiac output? What are the effects on oxygen delivery? No one's really looked at that serially over time. And I think it's something that if we can get some funding and willing athletes, we'll try to do it. All right, so let's shift gears over some biomechanical and neuromuscular factors. Again, athletes really want to see or feel like they have this uncoordinated turnover sometimes with returns. So we asked the question, do running mechanics change after altitude training? And this is in part to answer this question, and in part to go back to some of Philo's work and Chris's work on changes in running economy after altitude training. You know, we want to know, could we simply explain it by just gross changes in mechanics? So what we did is we used accelerometers. We attached them to the top of the shoelaces. And when you run them on a treadmill, you get a very, a signature that's very consistent across people. And we can tell very clearly when the foot hits the ground. We can tell very clearly when the toe hits the ground. And we can get it to the millisecond. So from that, we can get all sorts of variables: stride length, stride frequency, time on the ground, time in the air. And one of our graduate students, Abby Lehman, did a very nice job looking at this. And on all these graphs, we've got running velocity here. I stopped at 360 meters per minute for the comparison to running economy, but we actually took them out to 415 meters a minute. So we had them going pretty fast. So there's an application, if you will, over perhaps to sprinting and team sports in that standpoint. But here's ground contact time, time on the ground at these speeds, pre-altitude's the filled and post-altitude's the open. No difference in ground contact time. Here's stride frequency, no difference at all. These are elite distance runners. No difference in stride length. Found no differences. Okay, so at the end of the day, our take on the biomechanical side, again, this was a key take-home part of this data, though, is it was a live high, train low camp, where twice a week, sometimes 3 times a week, they went down to a lower altitude to do their high-intensity training. But at least by our hands, no changes in any of these biomechanical variables. We even did H-reflex testing to look at some neuromuscular function. No differences at all. So at least our recommendation might be that added time training at sea level doesn't appear necessary to address this component of biomechanical adaptation, but assuming that they're doing high-intensity training at low altitude, that may mitigate this change. If they live high and train high, might be a different story. All right, last one, ventilatory factors. What's the time course of the decay in ventilatory acclimatization with return to sea level? Well, here's some data that was collected in our lab. A lot of people don't know the Strayed-Gunderson paper from 2001. That was actually collected in our lab at Indiana University. And in both of these studies, this is a fairly common response across many studies. We see an increase in maximal exercise ventilation after altitude training. So one question we had is, how much of that increase in VO2 max simply went to, or how much of the increase, yes, in VO2 max simply went to fuel the respiratory muscles? And how much of it may be useful locomotor VO2, if you will? So Dan Wilhite, who's here, and you'll hear from him tomorrow, did a nice study. Well, before that, before we talk about Dan, let's talk about respiratory muscle oxygen uptake. As a function of ventilation, follows this curvilinear pattern. So obviously, if you increase ventilation at very high VEs, you're going to have a very large oxygen cost associated with it. So this increase in exercise ventilation may not be trivial. So here's what Dan did. Dan took a cohort that we took to altitude, did a high-low training camp, very fit individuals, similar in fitness to the Strayed-Gunderson group. Since both of these studies were collected in our lab using the exact same equipment, we went ahead and compared them. We saw almost the exact same change in VO2 max pre to post altitude. Now what we did is we used some existing data. If you're familiar with Elizabeth Aaron's work that she's done on ventilatory cost and mimic during exercise, we used her data to try to come up with an estimate of what's the change in the respiratory muscle oxygen uptake, with both of these groups seeing an increase in ventilation at VO2 max. And what Dan found is that the increased ventilation in this case accounts for an estimated about 20 to 25% of the increase in VO2 max upon return to sea level. Okay, but here's the question. We did an estimate of the respiratory muscle oxygen cost. We probably should measure it. Okay, so the next study we did is, and this is pilot data that we've collected on 6 male distance runners, quite fit. And what we did is pre-altitude, we did a hypoxic ventilatory response test. We did submax and maximal exercise. And then we also did a ventilatory mimic. We had them mimic at rest their exercise ventilation at different workloads and measured the VO2, or the oxygen consumption. When they mimicked their ventilation, we had them match their breathing frequency, their tidal volume, ideally their ventilatory volumes, which they did. We did a 28-day live high, train low altitude training camp. And then the key thing is we tried to serially measure these dependent variables upon return to try to look at some time course in decay and changes. And again, as I go through this, here's what I want you to do. I want you to keep in mind this concept of good, bad, good that the coaches believe to be the case. So the first variable I'm going to show you is quite simply heart rate during a submaximal but fairly quick pace of running. So pre-altitude, here's their heart rate on average, about 182 beats a minute. Post-altitude, we see a significant improvement. They're more fit, obviously, which is good. Okay, but look at what happens serially over time. Here's day 5. Here's day 12. And look at this. Here's a day 20. Right back down again. And in fact, this was the lowest heart rate of any of them. What about the hypoxic ventilatory response? So we see almost a 50% increase in the HVR. So obviously, ventilatory acclimatization went away quite quickly. Okay, what effects did we have potentially on cost of ventilation? And I don't want to go through this in large detail because Dan Wilhite is going to present this tomorrow at the student presentation, but here's their respiratory muscle oxygen costs during the mimic. Here's what it is on day 2, immediately upon return. Here's what it is day 6. Here's what it is day 13. Worst of all. And then guess what happens at day 21? Right back down again. Race performance outcomes. Hard part about this study is I couldn't have them do, with all these serial measures, also add in performance outcomes, but these are guys that at the time I coached them all, so they would do what I told them anyway. And after the altitude training camp, we did race twice. They raced the Mount Sac relays on day 9 and 10 and the Stanford Invitational on day 26. And I don't know if you can tell looking at it, basically every athlete improved, or even though this guy did a different event, relative to the national championship qualifying standards, relatively speaking, it's an improved performance. So anecdotally, within this bad window, we still had some good performances, but we had better performances waiting till a little bit later. So in conclusion, let's tie this all together. Immediately upon return, coaches consider to be good timing. We know that hemoglobin mass is going to be maximized. It's going to be the highest immediately upon return. We've shown, at least in our pilot data, a reduced cost of breathing. And Dan's going to talk to you a little bit about that tomorrow in terms of mechanism and what we think might be the reason why. And then what I think is very important is this increased training capacity. My experience is these guys come back from altitude, they're blood doped, if you will, and those first few workouts for that next 7 to 10 days, and Philo, you've probably seen this, they just hammer the crap out of them, for lack of a better, that's a scientific term for you, right? Okay, so what about during the bad timing? Well, we know hemoglobin mass is still going to be elevated. At least by our hands, we're seeing the cost of breathing go up a little bit. And then I'm kind of wondering, you know, how much of that is recovery from the hard training that they did back here? Certainly hormonal adaptations, many other things we could talk about. And then back in the good timing again, maybe hemoglobin mass is normalized, maybe cost of breathing is normalized, but I think a big part of this, again, is this adaptation, this training effect that takes place from the high-quality training that they've done immediately upon return. One other key thing, though, in timing that we haven't even talked about, and this is the last slide I'll show you, is you got to think of other factors. Certainly one of them is going to be heat acclimatization. If you go to altitude, it's usually dry, it's usually cooler, and our athletes had to compete in the World Championships in Daegu, where it was hot, it was wet. How do you time it and get this in there as well? So it's something you got to keep in mind. I want to thank our research team, graduate students. I know these look like mug shots, but that's just their student ID photos. That's the only thing I could get. And then the people who sponsored our research. So thank you.